A girl, my mother-in-law said flatly, setting down her tea like the word itself had gone sour in her mouth. Well, I suppose we'll have to adjust our expectations. The baby shower went quiet around us, 40 women holding pastel gift bags, watching Diane's face shift from polite anticipation to something closer to disappointment the moment the gender reveal cake was cut and pink frosting spilled out onto the plate. 3 days later, I found out exactly how far that disappointment went. If you've ever been betrayed by someone you trusted, hit the like button now. If you've ever stayed silent while someone underestimated you, comment here below. And subscribe to Story Retribution because today's ending proves that karma always arrives, just not when people expect it. My husband, Theo, was the only son in his family, the 4th generation to carry his father's name, something Diane had mentioned constantly throughout our 5 years of marriage. The family legacy, the importance of continuing the Whitfield lineage, the quiet but persistent expectation that our first child would be a boy who could carry that name forward into a 5th generation. I never fully understood how deeply this expectation ran until I got pregnant. The small betrayal happened about 4 months into my pregnancy, before we even knew the baby's gender. When Diane asked during a family dinner whether we'd considered finding out early through additional testing, adding, almost as an afterthought, just so we can start preparing properly, depending on what it is. I remember feeling a small flicker of unease at her phrasing, the way she said depending on what it is, like the preparation itself might change dramatically based on the answer. Theo brushed it off when I mentioned it later, explaining his mother simply had old-fashioned ideas that didn't really mean anything harmful, that she'd be thrilled regardless once the baby actually arrived. I wanted to believe him completely. The bigger betrayal, the one that reshaped everything, began unfolding the moment I cut into that gender reveal cake at my baby shower 6 weeks ago, surrounded by friends, family, and colleagues who had gathered to celebrate the beginning of my daughter's life. "A girl," Diane said flatly, setting down her tea. "Well, I suppose we'll have to adjust our expectations." A ripple of uncomfortable silence moved through the room before conversation resumed awkwardly, several guests exchanging quiet, confused glances. I brushed past the comment in the moment, too excited and overwhelmed to fully process what she'd actually said, focusing instead on opening the beautiful collection of gifts guests had brought. Tiny dresses, a hand-painted crib-mobile, a quilt my own mother had spent months sewing, dozens of thoughtful items representing genuine excitement for my daughter's arrival. I remember Diane's gift specifically, a gift bag she'd handed over with visibly less enthusiasm than the rest of the room, containing a plain, unremarkable baby blanket she mentioned, almost apologetically, she'd grabbed quickly since she hadn't had much time to shop. I didn't think much of it at the time, exhausted and overwhelmed by pregnancy hormones and the sheer emotional weight of the day. 3 days after the shower, my own mother called me, her voice tight with something I couldn't quite identify. "Sweetheart," she said carefully, "I need to tell you something, and I don't want you to get upset before you hear the full story." She explained that she'd stopped by Diane and Theo's father's house that morning to drop off a dish she'd borrowed weeks earlier, and while there, had noticed several large garbage bags sitting near the curb, clearly set out for collection. Something about the bags caught her attention. Fabric peeking through torn plastic, colors that looked distinctly familiar. "I looked closer," my mother said, her voice trembling slightly. "Sweetheart, they were the gifts. From your shower, the quilt I made, the mobile, several of the outfits guests brought, all of it, just sitting there in trash bags." I sat completely still on my kitchen floor, unable to process what she was describing, my mind refusing to fully accept that anyone, let alone my own mother-in-law, would deliberately discard gifts given with such genuine love and excitement for my daughter's arrival. I didn't confront Diane immediately. I needed to understand fully and completely exactly what had happened before accusing her of something this devastating. I called Theo that evening, explaining what my mother had discovered, watching his face shift through confusion, disbelief, and finally, a kind of dawning horror as the implications settled fully. "There has to be an explanation," he said, though his voice carried less conviction than his words suggested. "Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe someone accidentally grabbed the wrong bags. I wanted to believe that too. I genuinely did. But something about the specificity my mother described, the quilt, the mobile, items too distinctive to have been discarded accidentally, made the explanation feel increasingly unlikely the more I sat with it. We had, several months earlier, installed a small nanny camera system in the nursery we were setting up at Diane's house, since she generously offered to babysit regularly once the baby arrived. And Theo's father had insisted on having a dedicated space prepared there for visits. The camera had been recording continuously since installation, primarily intended for future use once our daughter actually started spending time there. I hadn't thought to check the footage until that night, sitting in stunned disbelief, scrolling backward through days of recorded activity until I reached the timestamp corresponding to the day after my shower. What I found made my hands shake so badly, I had to set my phone down twice before I could finish watching. The footage showed Diane, alone in the nursery, going through the gifts I had proudly displayed there just one day earlier, gifts I had carefully arranged, excited to begin preparing the space for my daughter's arrival. She examined each item briefly, the quilt, the mobile, several outfits, her expression unmistakably distasteful, before methodically placing them into large garbage bags she'd apparently brought specifically for this purpose. At one point, clearly unaware the nursery camera was recording, she said something out loud to herself, her voice carrying clearly enough for the microphone to capture it completely. "Pink everywhere," she muttered, shoving another small dress into the bag. Theo deserved better than this. The family deserved a real heir, not another disappointment in pink. I sat there, tears streaming down my face, watching my own mother-in-law describe my unborn daughter as a disappointment, watching her methodically discard gifts given with such love, all captured clearly on camera without her knowledge. The footage continued for several more minutes, showing Diane carrying the bags out to her car, presumably to transport them to her own house before eventually putting them out for trash collection, apparently intending to quietly erase every trace of the celebration that had happened just one day earlier. I showed Theo the footage that night. He watched in complete silence, his face growing increasingly pale, his hands clenched tightly by the time the recording ended. "I need to talk to her," he said, his voice shaking with an anger I'd rarely seen from him. "Tonight." I asked him to wait, needing time to process everything myself before deciding how to handle something this devastating, needing to understand whether this was an isolated moment of misguided disappointment or something reflecting a deeper pattern I needed to protect my daughter from entirely. Over the following 3 days, I quietly reviewed additional footage from the weeks preceding the shower, discovering several smaller, previously unnoticed moments that suddenly reframed themselves in devastating clarity. Diane referring to the nursery during a visit weeks earlier as temporary until things get sorted properly, a comment I dismissed at the time as simply unclear phrasing. Another moment showed her mentioning to Theo's father, offhandedly, that she hoped this pregnancy wouldn't be the only one. A comment that, viewed now through the lens of what I'd witnessed on camera, carried a much darker implication about her hopes for a future grandson to replace what she clearly viewed as an inadequate outcome. We decided, together, that this needed to be addressed directly, clearly, with undeniable evidence, rather than allowing Diane any room to minimize or deflect what she'd done. We invited Diane and Theo's father to dinner 4 days after the shower, framing it simply as a family dinner, giving no indication of what awaited her. Diane arrived warmly, complimenting the meal, asking casual questions about nursery preparations, seemingly entirely unaware that anything had been discovered. "Speaking of the nursery," Theo said carefully, midway through dinner, "we actually wanted to show you something." I opened my laptop, already prepared with the footage queued up, and turned the screen toward Diane and her husband. The footage began playing. Diane's own face, on screen, appeared in the nursery, methodically sorting through gifts before beginning to bag them for disposal. Her expression in real life shifted rapidly from confusion to dawning, horrified recognition. "Pink everywhere," her own recorded voice said clearly. Theo deserved better than this. The family deserved a real heir, not another disappointment in pink. The room went completely silent except for the recording continuing to play. "Wait, what?" Theo's father said, staring at the screen, then at his wife. his expression shifting from confusion to something considerably more severe. Diane's face had drained of all color, her hands trembling visibly against the table. I can explain," she stammered. "Explain what exactly?" Theo asked, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "Explain why you called your own granddaughter a disappointment before she's even born. Explain why you stole and discarded gifts given to us with genuine love just because she wasn't the son you wanted." Diane said nothing, her mouth opening and closing without producing any actual words. The careful, dignified persona she'd maintained throughout dinner completely collapsed. Theo's father turned to his wife slowly, his voice heavy with disappointment. "Diane," he said quietly, "how could you do something like this? To your own family?" "I just wanted," Diane started, then stopped herself, unable to finish a sentence that would have only confirmed exactly what everyone in the room had already heard clearly on the recording. The emotional resolution unfolded slowly and painfully over the following weeks. Theo, devastated by what his mother had revealed about herself, drew a firm boundary, explaining clearly that Diane would need significant, demonstrated change before being allowed unsupervised time with our daughter, that the nursery arrangement at her house was canceled entirely, that trust, once broken this fundamentally, couldn't simply be assumed moving forward. I replaced the discarded gifts as best I could, my own mother recreating portions of the quilt from photographs she'd taken before gifting the original. Friends generously replacing outfits and items once they learned, with my permission, exactly what had happened. Diane attempted, over the following months, several increasingly desperate efforts at reconciliation, apologizing repeatedly, insisting she'd reflected deeply on her behavior, requesting opportunities to prove she'd changed. Theo and I remained cautious, unwilling to simply restore access to our daughter based on words alone, insisting instead on a slow, carefully monitored rebuilding process that prioritized our daughter's safety and well-being above Diane's comfort. I didn't feel triumphant. Watching that footage play during dinner, watching Diane's carefully constructed image collapse in front of her own husband, I felt something far heavier, profound sadness that my daughter, not yet even born, had already been quietly rejected by someone who was supposed to love her unconditionally, layered over relief that we'd discovered the truth before she ever had the chance to feel that rejection directly herself. The final lessons settled over me slowly during my final weeks of pregnancy, preparing a nursery in our own home instead, surrounded by replaced gifts, and gathered love from people who had celebrated my daughter's arrival without a single moment of disappointment or hesitation. Diane had spent months assuming her disappointment could remain hidden behind polite, careful public behavior, that private moments of cruelty would simply stay private, invisible, easily denied if ever questioned. She mistook the absence of witnesses for the absence of consequences, never imagining that the same nursery she'd used to discard evidence of her cruelty would also quietly capture the undeniable proof of exactly what she'd done. I never raised my voice during that dinner beyond what needed to be clearly, calmly stated. I didn't need to. One nanny camera, positioned innocently for entirely different reasons, captured everything years of careful denial might otherwise have obscured indefinitely. Karma doesn't announce itself with shouting. It doesn't arrive the moment betrayal happens. Sometimes it simply waits quietly, recording in the background, until the exact moment someone tries to erase a child's worth before she's even had the chance to take her first breath. If this story resonated with you, hit that like button right now. Tell me in the comments, what would you have done in my situation? If you enjoy stories about family betrayal, emotional drama, shocking revenge, and the justice that always finds its way back, subscribe to Story Retribution and turn on the bell so you never miss the next story. Tomorrow's story might be even more unbelievable. See you then.